So what do you associate with the Daewoo brand? Probably with budget Korean cars from the recent past. But 30 years ago, Daewoo was more known in Russia for its refrigerators, microwaves, as well as TVs and CBRs. Many were surprised to find out that a home appliance manufacturer also made cars. And then there's another brand, Samsung. Nowadays, it's mostly associated with smartphones and often mentioned alongside Apple, Xiaomi, and Huawei. But back in the day, Samsung was seen more as a manufacturer of TVs, VCRs, refrigerators, and washing machines. Today, it's surprising that the auto company Daewoo and the smartphone maker Samsung used to produce similar products and even competed with each other. What's even more surprising is that beyond all of this, these companies were also building houses, ships, and locomotives. Samsung even ventured into pharmaceuticals, and Daewoo produced weapons. They both started from humble beginnings, Daewoo as a textile factory and Samsung as a rice flour producer. As you can see, answering what these corporations manufacture isn't easy. It's even harder to find something they don't do. This phenomenon has a name. These South Korean conglomerates are called chaebols, which roughly translates to rich family or money clan. Indeed, chaebols started as family businesses, but in the second half of the 20th century, with active government support, they became key drivers of the country's economy and creators of the South Korean economic miracle. However, chaebols aren't unique to Korea. They also exist in other Southeast Asian countries, and lately there's been growing discussion about the chaebolization of Russia's economy. In this video, we'll explore whether Russia and South Korea have much in common. Is Russia at risk of chaebolization? And most importantly, is this a good or bad thing? But first, let's look at why chaebols emerged in the first place and how they managed to trigger rapid economic growth. Interestingly, it all started not in Korea, but in Japan, where similar conglomerates were called zaibatsu, which has a similar translation. They originated in the 19th century and were highly successful until World War II. One of the first zaibatsu was the Mitsubishi Corporation. After Japan's surrender, Korea, which had been part of the Japanese Empire, gained independence and was later split into North and South Korea. Meanwhile, Japan fell under Allied occupation and its zaibatsu were reformed. Korea, having closely observed Japan's approach, decided to adopt it. Thus, chaebols were born. In fact, the word itself is the Korean pronunciation of the Japanese characters for zaibatsu. In the early 1960s, South Korea's economy was in shambles. GDP per capita was just over $1,500, almost 3 times lower than the global average and 11 times lower than in the US. How could they climb out of this hole? In 1961, following a military coup, General Park Chung-hee came to power. He was a rather strict dictator, and his economic policies were far from free market capitalism. The government under Park compiled a list of several dozen companies whose leaders were considered the most reliable and efficient, and the companies themselves large and stable enough. These firms, the chaebols, were tasked with creating an economic miracle. They were given priority access to loans and foreign investments. In return, they had to follow all government directives and conquer foreign markets. This form of capitalist central planning produced results. Every 10 years, GDP per capita doubled, continuing until the early 2000s. In the first half of the 1980s, South Korea caught up to the global average, and by the mid-1990s, it surpassed it by more than double. Chaebols like Samsung, LG, Hyundai, and Daewoo became well-known far beyond the country's borders. While growth has slowed in the past 2 decades, South Korea still exceeds the global average GDP per capita by 2.5 times, ranking alongside the UK, France, Belgium, and Finland in this regard. Isn't that a miracle? Now, let's shift our focus to Russia. There's a company called MTS. What do? They're a mobile operator. Then there's Sber, the most famous bank in Russia. But what if it's the other way around? In 2012, the MTS Bank brand emerged, and in 2016, the mobile operator Sber Mobile was launched. So you could just as easily say that MTS is a bank and Sber is a mobile operator. Sber also has a grocery delivery service, a marketplace, and an online pharmacy. In addition, it owns an online cinema, a taxi service, a city mapping app, and much more. MTS isn't falling behind either. Besides being a bank and mobile operator, they offer services like concert ticket sales and hotel bookings worldwide. In general, MTS and Spur increasingly resemble Daewoo and Samsung. They haven't yet ventured into race flour production or arms trading, but the trend is similar. More and more large Russian companies are starting to operate in non-core industries, expanding their influence throughout the Russian economy. It turns out that Russia, like South Korea, is also gradually becoming chaebleized. In fact, discussions about chaebleization in Russia didn't start today or yesterday. As early as 2002, analysts identified 8 diversified holding companies, including Lukoil, Alpha Group, and AFK Sistema. By the way, AFK Sistema is the owner of MTS. The process actually began back in the 1990s. The Russian banking system was just taking shape, and many industrial enterprises created their own banks to serve their needs. One of the most well-known examples is Menatep Bank, established by the Yukos Corporation. Interestingly, it was also included in that list of 8 holding companies. It didn't last long, but that's another story. This is what Russia's economic growth looked like from 1998 to 2008 GDP. Per capita increased 2.5 times over 10 years, which is comparable to South Korea's figures in the latter half of the last century, and even surpasses them. Of course, this was primarily due to oil revenues, which triggered a multiplier effect on the overall economy. However, it should be noted that without well-functioning business structures, this multiplier might not have activated, and oil dollars could have been spent solely on building palaces instead of fostering economic growth. Nevertheless, for the following 2 decades, chaebleization was not often mentioned until recently. The sanctions were a catalyst for this discussion. The first to bring up the topic was Vasily Osmakov, Deputy Minister of Industry and Trade. He explained why we are talking about moving towards chaebleization. When the market was global and loans relatively accessible, industry operated on its own, but as soon as serious sanctions were imposed, the need for financial partners and product sales through trading companies became evident. In other words, synergy between financial trading and industrial capital is now required. Chaebleization in form, if not in origin, will continue as a trend. In other words, whereas Warians used to operate successfully on their own, and in today's sanctions reality where industrial firms have restricted access to foreign financing and international markets, they now require ongoing financial and trade partners. As an example of a solution to this problem, Osmakov cites last year's purchase of the United Shipbuilding Corporation by VP Bank. He also mentions Gazprom Bank, which has a portfolio of various industrial enterprises. So chaebleization in Russia essentially means shifting the industry under the control of banks, which will develop long-term strategies for them and allocate funding accordingly. As a result, each bank will turn into an analog of a chaebol, overseeing a diverse range of enterprises and financially supporting their operations. Formally, this isn't quite the same scenario as in South Korea. First, these cables won't have family ownership. Second, the funds and tasks will not be allocated by the government, but by the banks. However, the banks themselves will likely still be mostly under state control. But overall, the essence remains the same: to unite diverse businesses into single holdings and develop them within a common strategy. At first glance, this sounds reasonable, but an economically savvy viewer might immediately protest, wait a minute, isn't this monopolizing the economy? Indeed, such absorption of one market player by another and their transformation into large conglomerates closely resembles the creation of monopolies. However, there's an important distinction. Monopolies absorb their competitors and completely take over the market. Here, consolidation occurs not vertically but horizontally. Chaebols acquire companies from entirely different sectors, and none of them fully controls the market. On the contrary, they can compete against each other, much like Samsung, LG, or Daewoo and Hyundai do. Thus, chaebleization isn't monopolization, even though both involve business consolidation. Nevertheless, chaebleization of the economy carries both advantages and challenges. While chaebols are not monopolies or cartels and do not influence prices, competition still suffers as a result. A new startup or small business faces far more challenges than a massive conglomerate that controls the entire production cycle. And even if a startup manages to withstand competition, a holding company can easily buy it out. Furthermore, within the chaebols themselves, the environment is much less conducive to innovation. As vertically integrated structures, they lack flexibility and efficiency. They can crush or absorb a small competitor, but it's unlikely they'll create something innovative on their own. But moreover, chaebols often become repositories for bad assets. In a classic market system, such enterprises should go bankrupt. But when they become part of a conglomerate, they remain as dead weight, deteriorating its financial performance. If the number of these bad assets continues to grow, it will create risks for the entire holding. And since the economy of the country relies heavily on chaebols, this could lead to a full-blown financial crisis. For example, in 2018, MTS planned to create a service called MTS Cash for automatic online payment processing. To this end, it acquired the company Cloud Retail for 620 million rubles. In the end, the service never launched, the acquired assets depreciated, and the losses amounted to 765 million rubles. But these losses are modest compared to Spurs, whose losses from non-core assets total in the tens of billions. Most of these losses come from the e-commerce sector, specifically the marketplaces. However, for a bank whose total profit amounts to 1.5 trillion rubles, this is a minor issue. The central bank has also pointed out this problem. Banks invest depositors' funds into new businesses and their own expansion. The returns from these businesses may be less and come later than what the bank of the ecosystem expects. But that's not a concern for depositors whether the online cinema or even a network of online cinemas owned by the bank turns out to be profitable. The logic here is as follows. While these ecosystems are great, the investors, not the depositors, should bear the costs. This encapsulates the issue of chaebelization. When we deal with the merger of diverse assets into unified holdings, customers of one service effectively cover the losses of another. In simple terms, by paying a fee for a money transfer, you are compensating the losses of the marketplace. And by purchasing a mobile data package, you are paying for failed investments in online cash register services. But bank customers and mobile subscribers didn't sign up to pay for a marketplace or online cash register. However, buying such services and creating ecosystems isn't the most significant problem of chaebelization. After all startups generate losses in their early years, and only later do some become market leaders. Therefore, one can come to terms with Spurs' losses in non-core areas, anticipating that convenient services will emerge in the long run and eventually become profitable. But it is much more concerning when banks acquire production assets. These are no longer startups that can be easily bought and rapidly scaled, and if necessary, restructured into something new. When you own a huge, loss-making factory, it will be a money pit, draining funds from the bank that acquired it. And since this primarily involves state-owned banks, it essentially translates into lost revenue for the budget, which flows through the banking system into numerous inefficient enterprises like a black hole. Is such an economy necessary? What conclusion can be drawn? The chaebol system works well under conditions of catching-up development. When the state has a dozen or so large, reliable companies instead of market chaos, it is much easier and quicker to elevate the economy to a global level. However, once that path is traversed, orders from the center start to work less effectively. It is impossible to simply command the creation of something innovative because no one yet knows what to create. Free movement of capital and venture investment institutions are essential for this. It is in such conditions, through trial and error, that companies capable of changing the world are born. This does not occur at the behest of officials or bankers, but through the funding of venture investors who see potential in a startup and are willing to share risks with its founders. The chaebelization of the Russian economy may ease the challenges faced by enterprises in today's tough conditions. This is undoubtedly a positive. However, in the long term, it could lead to adverse consequences. If major state banks become the primary market players, owning all possible types of businesses, then new promising startups will soon be absorbed into these holdings, integrating into their structures and losing their potential, turning into mere cogs in the larger machine. Therefore, solving tactical problems may lead to much more serious structural issues. That's all for now. If you enjoyed the video, please support us with a like and subscription. See you next time.